Hey, what's up? Welcome back. In the last two episodes, you learned how to set up RSpec Rails and then set up FactoryBot, which are two tools for helping with testing. Again, we're kind of going through the process of trying to make some content here for Shanmugam about RSpec and RSpec tests for both the controller and the model. And we're working our way up from just kind of setting up the test framework. And oftentimes that can be sort of the most tedious part, is just getting everything set up so that it runs. And then once you have sort of a framework in place and your generators in place, it can be much easier to actually do the right thing and sort of implement tests. So now that we have some testing set up in our application, what I wanted to do is just write some very simple model tests. So here we have in our app models directory, a lot of these models are basically just like models that are wrapping up database fields, but we don't have any logic written in Ruby. So for example, like a form4 transaction, it has all this data, but we don't actually write any methods inside of form4 transaction. So there are many here that don't have anything other than just association. So we have a company. Form4 though is one that's quite interesting. We have a handful of methods in here letting us know whether or not we should sort of notify based on this. Again, we're building a Form4 tracker for SEC filings that are required filings by people who are considered insiders by the Security and Exchange Commission in the United States. And this is going to tell us whether or not, or it tells us about trades that they've made in their own companies. And then we try to like look through some of that data to figure out if it might be interesting for us to trade the same stock. And so we have some methods here whether or not we should notify. And this one in particular says like if the Form4 was a buy, so did they buy some shares? Were they a leader in the company? So we define leader as just kind of this like regular expression. And then is the number of shares changing the total holdings by more than 5%. It says 5% in the comment, but really it's 10%. And so this method here is doing a handful of different things. We also have some helpers down here for the percent that it is changing in their holdings, whether or not they're a leader, and whether or not they should buy. And so what I want to do is go through and write some tests for each of these methods that we can run. We don't actually have a spec for this model yet. So in spec models, there will be a form spec.rb. Instead of writing that manually, we can say, okay, so we should be able to say Rails G RSpec :model for form4, and this will create the model spec for us. This is if you have existing models that don't have RSpec files created for them when you were first starting out. And you don't necessarily need to do this. You could just go and create the file by hand, but I like to do it this way because it creates both the spec file for us and also the factory for us. So now if we head over to our Form4 spec, you'll see that we have a pending test here. Okay, that's great. And then we also have a factory for Form4s. So this Form4 factory doesn't have any fields in it, but we might want to go and set up a bunch of fields based on our test. The other thing too that I'm using here with Vim is the Vim Rails plugin. So let me show that. In my vimrc.bundles, Vim Rails. So I'm using this plugin by T-Pope. This is pretty handy for moving around different files. So I can say like, I can hover over Form4 here and say GF, and that will jump into the model file. You can also say like :A. So it says like, give me the alternate from this test file. So that if you're in a controller spec, it'll jump to the controller. If you're in a model spec, it'll jump to the model. So that can be pretty handy. All right, so let's actually write some tests based on this Form4. So I'm going to pull up the Form4 model, and the very first one that we might want to do is buy. Just like what does it mean for a Form4 to buy? So now we're going to say it correctly derives if it's a buy. Now we want to say Form4 is equal to create :form4, and we want to specify some shares. So this is the thing that we want to pass in when we're creating our model. So that's the one thing that we want to control, because that's the one thing that's being used as part of our method here. And we can say some shares is like 1. Okay, and then we would say expect form4.toBe. And we can actually just say to be buy, because buy is a method that ends in a question mark. And so this is just a shortcut. So I'm going to use my Command H is my leader key when I'm using Vim test to quickly run this spec. And what we're seeing here is we have an active record validation failure because the company and the insider must exist. So when we're creating a new instance of a form 4, it belongs to a company and it belongs to an insider. So the factory that was created for us, so form 4's factory, this needs to have a company and it needs to have an insider. So now if we ran this test again, it's going to fail because we don't actually have factories for companies or insiders yet. So we kind of need to do a little bit more legwork here. So let's again say Rails G RSpec model for our company, and same thing for insider. This will create the factories for a company and the factories for an insider, which we can then use inside of our form 4 factory. So we go back to our form 4 spec and rerun this test. All right, so now we're getting a null constraint because the column CIK violates that null constraint. So as part of creating a company, we need to pass in the CIK. So now we can go to our company's factory and make sure that the CIK field is populated. Let's also just go to the company model and see if there's any other that are non-null. Okay, so we need an ID, we need a CIK, and this is going to be, potentially we could just make this a sequence of CIK, and we'll say n, and then we'll just say, we'll return the string like CIK dash, and then the number there. And that will create a company object that has a CIK that is sequenced for every single time we create a company. It'll just create one CIK1, CIK2, CIK3, etc. So that's the only field that is non-nullable, and I think this should work fine if I spell sequence correctly. All right, so now we have our first passing test, but it's bad if we start off with the test passing because we want the test to fail. We want the test to fail. So in order, when you're writing tests, it's very important to make sure that the test is failing, because if the test passes out of the gate, it could be that you wrote your test incorrectly, or it could be that your code works perfectly. So in order to isolate and make sure that your code is working perfectly, what I like to do is first go into the code that I'm running the test for and actually comment the entire thing out, and then I'll run my test. And I want to work forward and sort of solve each of these smaller failing expectations. So here, this first error is saying that like it expected this giant form object to respond to by question mark, and it didn't. So now we can comment in that method, right? And that will make it so that we know for sure that we're calling the right method. And we want to see the error message change. So we want to just keep seeing the error message change. So here we see expected it to be truthy, but we got nil. Okay, so we're making progress. Now we can comment this in, and now we should see our test, I believe, pass here. Okay, but ensuring that it is a by while some shares is positive is only half the test, right? So we also need to create another form 4, and in this case, we'll pass in a sum shares of -1, and then we want to make sure that it's not a by, so not to be a by. So we can use the not. I can't remember if it's not in front or behind, or maybe they both work, but these are the two things that I would probably run to test to make sure that by is working successfully. Let's do another example here. So leader. So it correctly it determines if the insider was a leader. So the reason why we calculate whether or not it was a leader as part of the form 4 is that an insider might be an investor in one company, they might be the CFO of another company, and they might be a CEO of a third company. And so rather than tracking the officer's title on the insider itself, we want to use the form 4, which is sort of a snapshot in time of when they traded. And here in this case, we want to control officer title. So here we're going to say form 4 is equal to create form 4, where the officer title is maybe CEO, and then we want to say expect form 4 dot to be leader, and we can do this again for all of the different. We might want to go through and just say like all of the different like officer titles that we consider to be leaders. The other way we could do this is actually by just creating a list of all the things that we want to test and ensure. So we could say like CEO, comma CFO, comma like pres, and then we can say dot each do title, And so we can use loops inside of our tests. We don't necessarily need to write out every single thing hard coded, right? And so this can say, like, if the officer title is one of these, title, then we want to expect and ensure that it is a leader. Now, if you imagine that, like, as your application develops and grows, this regular expression that we're checking to see if it's a leader or not might also grow pretty substantially, right? So, like, at first we're just sort of copying and pasting each of these different possible values, and I'm just going to grab the rest of these to be like super complete. Okay, and then let's clean this up a little bit. So the point that I wanted to make here was that if you're doing this sort of testing where you're going to run like a bunch of different string values, this is one option to do it. But there is a downside to using create, because every single title here, we're going to create a new form for, save it in the database just so that we can call this bLeader method, right? So if we say run this test, we're going to say command H or leader H. That's going to run my test. And here we see that this took 3.3 seconds to load or whatever, or this finished in, you know, 1/8 of a second or whatever that is, right? And so one thing we can do is change this directly to build, because our method, our leader method, does not require that this model is actually saved to the database. We can actually do this up here also, build and build. And now when we run this test, recall that last time it was 0.16 seconds to run the test. Now if we run the same exact test, we get 0.14. It's only a hair quicker, but yeah, the files were, like, it's a large portion of it is being spent on loading the files. But if you could imagine that, like, the bigger this list gets, the more important it is to only create and persist things to the database that need to be persisted to the database in order for the assertions to be true or to, you know, succeed. All right, so I think we've got whether or not it was a leader. Let's also put in some tests here that are not leaders. So we can say, like, I don't know, director. I think we have director as like a definitely like not a leader role, but I'm going to also use an array here, and I'm going to do the same the same process to not to be a leader, because in the future we might want to, like, make specific assertions about certain titles and make sure that they are not considered leadered. So we can start off with an array here and then add to it as we go along. But we want to have at least one that is the inverse of what we're checking above. Okay, let's do %change now. So %change calls two methods. It calls sum shares and it calls sum shares after. And it does a little bit of division and then multiplies to figure out what is the % that the holdings changed here. So let's make another method. So it's has the right %change. The names of the tests here that I'm writing are not very good, but it's kind of, yeah, hopefully it'll give you an idea, a rough idea of things that you might test. So here we want to create another form for. We're going to say, in this case, again, build, because we don't actually need to persist this to the database, form for. And we want to pass in this case, sum shares. And let's try to make this easy. So let's say that they have 200 shares, and the shares that they purchased, oh yeah, so let's say that they bought maybe 50 shares here, and sum shares after is 200. Then we would expect form for dot % change to equal what is that, 25? And I think it's going to be like 25.0 because we're doing fdiv. So let's just see if this works. All right, so we've got another passing test. Now, the other thing too is, like, every single time that you get a test to pass, recall that we should probably comment out and then comment those back in. So now we're to the place where we've written leader and we've written %change. So I'm going to do command L, rerun all the tests, and then sort of comment those back in. So, all right, undefined method %change. Let's comment that back in, and then we'll run that again. It's going to say percent change return nil instead of 25. Okay, let's comment that back in, run it again. All right, now we have 2 passing tests. Now the issue is it's not responding to leader ? So we'll comment that back in, run the tests again. Again, you want like a super fast feedback loop. Okay, so expected to be truthy, but we got nil. So now let's comment this back in, and all of our tests should now be passing fine. And the amount of coverage that we have on this model is pretty nice. So the only thing that we have left here is should notify. And so in here we should say like it should only notify when by leader and percent change is greater than threshold. Okay, so now we want to again create a form 4 where the percent change is greater than whatever our number is here. If you're going to change or configure this percent change number, you might want to also make this a constant. So in this case, let's say that like the percent change threshold is equal to 10, and then here we can use that constant. That way we have access to this constant from our tests. So we could even use that here, is greater than, and then we can put in like, I don't know, like form for percent change threshold. And now when we run the test, it should actually like print out that title. We don't actually have any expectations here. Expect false to be true. Okay, so now our you can see that our message here, form 4 should only notify when by leader and percent change is greater than 10. So 10 is actually like in the title here because it's using that constant, and also our method here is using the constant. The nice thing about that is if we ever want to change this percent change threshold, we can just come in here and say like, oh, we actually want it to be 12 now, and now our tests are going to depend on the constant, and also our implementation is going to depend on the constant. So we don't have to like go change both of them at the same time. So let's do that now. So let's say it is 10, and then what we can do as part of our expectation is we need to make sure that it's a buy. It is a buy since it's greater, some shares is greater than 0. We need to set the title. So officer title is CEO, and we also need to make sure that the percent change is less than 100%. If it's, I just have this this one setting where if they are buying 100% of their shares, it's often they're getting their first grant or something, and it doesn't really, it's not very indicative of anything interesting. So now we can say expect form 4 dot to be should notify. That's yeah, it's a little bit, I mean, maybe this should just be called like notify, like that, whatever, or notified, and that might be, yeah, might make a little bit more sense. Again, we're going to need to comment out our implementation and then run the code or run our tests. We should see like, oh, it doesn't respond to should notify. Okay, comment that back in, run it again. Okay, now it's expecting it to be truthy. We can comment this back in, and now we should be good to go. The other thing you might do is we want to like, now we need to make it fail for each of the individual forks in the change. So we could say like, well, one option here is that we can say like, okay, it should notify when it's each of these things. It should not notify when it's a sale. So it should not notify when sale. So then here we can say like, oh, the sum shares is actually like -50, and we should expect it not to be. Okay. All right, that's going to pass immediately. One thing we could do is actually comment out that part and see that it fails because it needs to check that it is a sale. So the percent change is also negative. So by and percent change are duplicative here, but that's fine. I think percent change, we should probably also make this, we could make percent change a absolute value, but whatever. This is kind of like how I might do this. The thing that I wanted to show is not necessarily like how you write all these different tests, but instead how you can organize this. So at this point, we have like just a handful of methods in this model, right? Should notify, percent change, leader, and by. And up to this point, we've sort of put in this first case, we put correctly derives if it's a by, and we executed 2 different assertions in the same if block. So in practice, you probably want to have only one assertion or sort of only be checking one use case. So it can actually be a little bit better to just say like it correctly knows, or like it knows if it's a sale, and have these be separate if blocks that are part of your test suite, so that you can isolate very specific use cases and flows, control flows, so that you don't have to like sort of guess which one you're going down. Now, as soon as you start breaking up your if blocks so that you have several per method, right? So for this one by method, we now have 2 different if blocks. What you can do is you can organize those under sub describe blocks. So let me show you what I mean. So I can here say describe by question mark do, and then I can put end down below, and now it's going to nest this method inside. The other thing you might do is put like pound sign. That's to sort of say that this is an instance method instead of a class method. And right now, our output, our RSpec output is just doing dots. We can also configure that to show like a more verbose output with more details about our method. So let's do that. So format progress. That's I think the default. Let's try it. -- format documentation. And then we can just run this again. Let's see if it. Okay, here we go. So this is a little bit more detailed output from every single test run. It depends. It's kind of like a personal preference if you want to just see dots across the screen, or if you want to see full output with all the details. For now, it can be handy to see this organization in the documentation format. So we've got form 4, and then under the form 4, these 2 specs are about the by method. So similarly, we can organize these under like describe the officer or like leader method, right? And that's, again, we would probably split this into 2 different if blocks, one that's checking if it is a leader, one that's checking if it's not a leader. And then down here below, we have should notify. So we'll describe should notify do. And similarly with our, if we're testing inside of a controller or something, we would want to say like each of the different routes. So now this should be organized really well underneath some sort of names that are organizing the tests for each of the methods that we wrote. All right, so now we can see all of these are right. This one we didn't organize under anything special yet, but you can kind of see the output is now documenting as it's documenting how the form 4 works. So this can be like a nice way to see the output. All right, I think that's probably good enough for the form 4 method. It's also giving us a scaffold that we could just easily drop into if we wanted to add more functionality to form 4 or change it in some way. We could quickly update the tests and assert that changes that are happening to our form 4 model are working as expected. All right, so that's how I would go about testing some really basic methods inside the model that are sort of helper methods for deriving certain things about the data that's in the database. In the next video, we'll go into some more complex testing for models, and we'll talk about how we tested a couple other features of this application. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.